Just a minute. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the latest seminar in the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. Today, we are very fortunate and happy to have with us Carter Brandon. He is a fellow with the I'm going blank for a second, a senior fellow with the World Resources Institute.
There you
And
go.
I got it. I had it in the brain. It just had to come out. And and he'll be speaking today on natural capital. And we're very, very grateful and thankful that he's here today to speak on this topic. We've been looking for somebody to speak on this. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Carter, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, John. Thanks to the Society. Happy to be here. Um, we're a small group, so very informal. Happy to be interrupted. Happy to leave time for discussion. By way of introduction, I'm a ex-World Bank, among other things, an ex-World Bank economist. I ended up there, well, I left 6 years ago, but I ended up as the lead economist for environment and climate change. And I want to just explain what that means for those who may not know the World Bank. The Environment Group lends $2 to $3 billion a year for what we call green, brown, blue projects. So the lead economist there is very involved in policy dialogue with countries on natural resources, green, pollution, blue, brown, and water, oceans, wetlands, blue. Very much valuation of how nature can be integrated into public policy and investment projects. In contrast, the climate group doesn't lend a penny. So there's no such thing as a World Bank climate project, really. There are development projects by the other, we call them global practices, but departments, energy, agriculture, water, macro health. There's about 12 of them. And so the climate group just exists to make sure all the other departments do things in a climate smart way. So that's very much a job that has to do with outreach, persuasion, cross-cutting, cross collaboration of concepts. And I bring that in because natural capital is a fundamentally cross-cutting mainstream topic. And I would consider myself a practitioner, not a modeler per se, but quite experienced in how natural capital concepts can be adopted by government, can be used to shape investment priorities or policy priorities. So with that introduction, let me share my screen. And I called my topic, my talk for today. There, you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes,
Great,
sorry,
thanks.
I didn't get my
Yeah,
button.
I want to talk about using natural capital, sort of macro and micro levels, maybe also called uh, top down, bottom up. I don't have any idea what level of you are all in terms of being practitioners or using natural capital, but I'm assuming that we have a common starting point, that we um, believe in the, trying to chip away at the economics of nature, because if we can incorporate multiple values of nature and ecosystem services into economic analysis, that will generate better ecological, economic, and social outcomes. I assume we agree with that. You will see by the end of this talk there's a lot going on, and I'm also quite discouraged about the level of impact that we've been able to have. And that's really just by way of looking at the um, outcomes that we're seeing in the world, the trends, whether it's ecological or climate, etc. Again, here's some introductory comments on the left-hand side. I'm finishing this sentence. Using natural capital concepts is vital from what I just said. We need to do this because so much of what's happening in the world is unsustainable. Using natural concepts is lagging. I'm going to prompt you in a minute to see if you can think of the 7 Nobel Prize winners over the past 50 years who've tackled ideas of bringing nature into economics, into GDP, into measuring growth, valuing welfare, etc. But it's been a long slog, and I did a article with a few of us did an article. It's in REAP, the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, 4 years ago now, on trying to integrate natural capital into national accounts and documenting that it really hasn't happened in spite of these efforts. So number three, it's very partial. There are some limited successes. We have some applications that are work, and it's not completely a scorched earth experience. We know that natural capital is very complex, and we'll get into this. It's large scale, cross-sectoral, interlinked, uncertain, irreversible, and it's very political. So these are all challenges that go with it. And last comment, the wave of the future. There's a pun there for those of you who know. WAVES was a long-term World Bank program called Wealth Accounting and the Valuation of Economic Services. It's been shut down. It was very elaborate to help countries like Rwanda, Costa Rica, Colombia, Philippines, Zambia, Botswana. Quite a few countries tackled natural capital accounting. But my conclusion is, as you see on the right-hand side, the top-down analysis has lacked policy impact, and that local and sectoral analyses are more promising. So this slide kind of gives you a preview of what I'll talk about, but I'll be adding a whole bunch of examples. Oh, across the bottom, those are the Nobel Prize winners who have tackled this general topic, going back Nordhaus, William Nordhaus, and James Tobin, Robert Solow, Tinbergen, a little later in life, Stiglitz and Arrow. So it's a good group. If they were here today, they'd probably all share their frustrations, as do I. I'm going to give an overview of kind of natural capital tools and applications. This is from the article I mentioned. It's cited at the bottom of the screen. SNA is a big deal. It's the holy grail of trying to create green GDP. There's a lot of work, in contrast to the macro level, at the micro level to value nature. And again, I don't know where you all stand, but presumably a lot of us do work at the micro level. I think of environmental economics, ecological economics, essentially a microeconomic topic focused in my world on externalities. Then shy of national accounts, number three, there's been a lot of work on national income and measuring how does environmental degradation and loss and flows affect income, even if it's not aligned with national accounts. And then different from income, there's been a lot of work on wealth, which is the stock, the assets, and this is the comprehensive wealth looks across produced capital, human capital, natural capital, sometimes social capital. These are the forms of capitals that lead to very interesting analysis with a certain amount of impact, and then other. So on the right-hand side, I have some more details. I won't go into too much detail, but in terms of the system of national accounts, basically the approach to have supplemental accounts or satellite accounts is where the work is being done. The idea of green GDP is just not manageable. It's very difficult, fragmented, ultimately not politically supported or accepted, given the uncertainty and the valuation challenges, et cetera. So we can essentially scratch number one. On valuation, and you probably all have worked in this area, there's a lot of I would say generally accepted methodologies. They've been accepted by economists, they've been accepted by the court system and legal proceedings on liability, etc. Obviously, not very much accepted by the Trump administration, because as you've probably seen, they banned the use of the concept of the social cost of carbon after a lot of work over decades that's gone into that those concepts. Um, then on the national income, here are the names of what kind of look at some of this: the adjusted savings, the uh, the system of environmental economic accounts under the UN, the gross ecological product under China. Very interesting, and I'll get into that. On comprehensive wealth, the changing wealth of nations, the UNEP inclusive wealth indicators. Both of these have been very, I think, fruitful and both disbanded. The last Changing Wealth of Nations came out last year, and the World Bank has decided to stop it. I'm not quite sure what happened in UNEP with the inclusive wealth work. It was under Partha Dasgupta, and I think they've run out of steam. Maybe somebody can correct me if they know more. And then there's been lots of other efforts to track the relationship between natural capital and economics. There's been work on global footprints, biocapacity, progress, material flow, the natural capital index, the planetary boundaries. I bolded that because I think that's probably by far the most significant one of these. You've probably all heard of the Rockstrom et al. Planetary boundaries that they just updated. And then TEEB, again, you probably know, which has also been shut down, except for some work in agriculture. So of these, I mean, there's been a lot of efforts. And if you want more information, you can go to that article. But I'm going to drill down a bit more on examples of what's still going on. And then I have a shout out to spatial analysis. Very extensive, super promising, very exciting, driven by ecologists. Ecologists are far ahead, in my view, of economists in integrating idea, modeling and integrating idea of natural capital. I see I have the acronym NCPs at the bottom: Nature's Contributions to People, which is out of the IPBES um, um, framework. Maybe you know that, but this is just a map that's current work that shows overlay between biodiversity and development, and where development is a fundamentally sectoral and economic concept. I actually am part of a National Science Foundation network that specializes in global, local, global, which is like the whole network of universities and think tanks uh, exists to look at what is top-down good global analysis. How can we test it at the local level and and see if we have any traction on the ground in terms of local actions, local decisions, local financing. And then what are the lessons going from the local, how this works, back to the global to adjust our models and our understanding of how the world works. So spatial analysis is very much part of rising through the ecological ranks, and economists are very slow. So I'll stop there for a minute. I can't see everybody, but is there any question or comment at this point before I get into a bunch of examples of top down and bottom up? John, maybe you can moderate. Is there
Sure.
anyone?
The people can either put it in the chat or raise your hand, and however you'd like.
Well, I don't see the chat either. Maybe.
I've got it. So if something pops up, I can tell you what it says.
Okay. Okay. Well, the classic, when people talk about natural capital, sometimes people think natural capital and natural capital accounting are the same thing. They're not. Of course, natural capital feeds into natural capital accounting, but the accounting framework is very thorough, very difficult, I would say. And it starts with physical accounts and then it moves to monetary accounts. And this is just the structure of this is as endorsed by the UN with a lot of input from many organizations. And this was endorsed 10 years ago, something like that. And a lot of countries, mainly Europe and OECD countries, have a segment of SIA accounts. Very few have the whole thing, but as you see on the left-hand side, there's analysis of assets, and you need an understanding of the stock of these assets. And on the right-hand side, you have you move towards flows and what are the additions and reductions to the various stocks, and then by the end of the day, you can show change. Um, as I say, most countries, well, this has to be tackled in physical units, and most countries stop with physical units. They don't value all of this because it's very difficult, very time consuming, and uh, the policy return or payback of doing all this work isn't always evident. I think a few countries, Australia, Canada, UK, Netherlands, are considered the leaders in doing full SIA accounts.
Perfect.
Um,
We have actually a question I think kind of
yeah,
ties with what you're discussing. From Peter May. What about the experimental ecosystem accounts developed by UNSD? They are now no longer experimental, but is anyone actually developing such accounts?
yeah, that's my next slide, Peter.
Ah,
So the first SIA, it's called the Central Framework, is essentially, if you look at the asset types on the left-hand side, these are productive assets, and or integrated into production systems, including water. But it was called experimental ecosystem accounts. Now they have been approved. The final manual was just published last year. It took 10 years of lots of consultations. Is anyone doing this? I'm not sure. But again, my hands-on experience through the World Bank, which had a trust fund, which meant millions of dollars going to individual countries, millions going to support a team. Well, not millions, but a lot enough to support a team in Costa Rica of 5 people in the central bank, to support a team of 5 or 10 people in Colombia in the statistics office, to support a team in Philippines in the planning ministry. After 3 years, they just never got there. They didn't get to the monetary side. And this chart shows the physical and the monetary separately. 1, 2, 3 are physical. 4 and 5, the darker blue, are monetary. Um, I don't have a comprehensive take on how much this is actually being done in practice. But with my ear to the ground, again, I like to think in terms of outcome and results. Um, I haven't heard much coming from SIA ecosystem accounting. Where it comes from, and I'm going to end up on this again, I'm flagging my theme for this talk, is at the micro level, where you can value nature and integrate it in concrete sector plans, investment programs, project level analysis. That's where people can understand the valuation, do the consultations to get buy-in and support, integrate natural capital valuation with other financial and economic valuation, and then and use it sort of in what is a clear decision-making process. The problem we've found, there's a lot of problems we've found with SIA, is that it's not part of any decision-making process. There isn't a lot of ownership except for the statistical agencies, and the statistical agencies aren't really at the table when decisions are being made. So there are issues with SIA. Again, it's elegant, it's just difficult.
there's
I see
another
another couple
couple,
chats. Yeah, great.
yep,
Come in.
couple questions. First by Laura, is ecosystem accounting becoming a mandatory requirement for EU member states?
Good question. I know the SIA central framework is mandatory. I can't answer that question because the ecosystem accounting was just approved last year. If somebody wants to Google that while I'm talking, we would have the answer by the end of the end of the session.
I believe the answer is yes, but so,
Okay.
and Joan wrote, although it took a while, the Philippines just signed a natural capital into law last year, Republic Act number 11995, Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System Act. I guess more of a comment than a question. And then Peter wrote Brazil produced initial partial sectoral tables for water, energy, forest, and land use change using the central framework and the experimental ecosystem approach. But there's not
Mhm.
much follow-up since it was all done by consultants. However, there's a national commitment to ecological accounting and law. So if you'd like to comment on either of those.
Well, I wouldn't mind. The Brazil experience is very typical that a lot of consultants do get involved, and it gets to the ownership issue that I mentioned. And again, I'm not totally pessimistic about this. I'm just saying in practice, it's been really difficult. Um, in the Philippines, Joan, I don't know if you want to comment what that means, a Natural Capital Accounting System Act. Again, countries commit to do this. I mean, the OECD does it. But it's a long-term endeavor, and part of my conclusion is we don't always have time to do this. There's a lot that we can do to bring natural capital into decision making, and I personally am not convinced that natural capital accounting, the macro level, top down, um, is the critical component of trying to do better. Again, that's me. Okay, let me keep going. Here's another. Now, the World Bank did the Changing Wealth of Nations series of publications for um, more than 10 years. They did about every 3 years, and the last one came out last year, 2024. This, again, it's not compatible with GDP, but it values the capitals, as I mentioned. And this is kind of the type of benchmarking that, as a World Bank economist, we found quite valuable in two ways. This is so, as you can see, the book cover on the left, if you look at it closely, it says Overview 2024. This is the most recent analysis, and their data is all online. But if you look at the source on the bottom left, it says 2018. So this is the previous version, a graph from that previous version, but the trend hasn't changed that much. The what the graph shows is total um, um, income per wealth per capita, and the very income dependent, because the richer countries on the right, if you look at wealth per capita, adding across produced capital, human capital, natural capital, uh, the rich countries are getting richer in terms of wealth per capita, and the poor countries are getting poorer. Now, I said this has been very useful in two ways. One way is as a definition of sustainability. If your per capita wealth is declining, it's hard to say that you have a sustainable economy with um, the resources needed to generate future incomes for future generations. If you don't have the capital base, you probably won't have the income flows to support any form of income growth. So the richer countries are doing much better in that regard. The second way this was very useful was benchmarking. And for example, I worked a lot in Colombia, and the benchmarking, particularly in terms of forestry, was much worse than when benchmarked against Mexico, and Colombia took that very seriously. I worked in Laos, and their indicators were much worse than Vietnam, and they took it very seriously. So it takes, it depends who you're comparing your own country with, but Laos and Vietnam and Colombia and Mexico happen to be very good comparisons. And as a result, both countries borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars to turn around its management of natural capital. Well, Colombia borrowed $1.2 billion, focused primarily on green growth. And Laos, it's a much smaller country. I think it was about $100 million, but it was a significant um, benefit of being able to introduce this wealth data to ministries of finance who aren't tuned into specific sectoral issues, but understand capital. And so this was very valuable. Here's just a couple more graphs that give you a flavor of what the Changing Wealth in Nations analysis offered. The one on the left, shows the blue line is natural capital as a share of total wealth, and the bars are natural capital per capita. So you get two completely contradictory trends. I will start with the low income, which is the bar on the left. Natural capital is almost half of the wealth of low income countries. A lot of this might be, I mean, in your mind, you can think of sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of both what we call renewable natural capital, which are the sort of the ecosystems, and then non-renewable, which would be minerals. Um, uh, Very high share of wealth and low natural capital per capita. When you jump to the high income countries, the opposite is true. Natural capital is a very low share of total wealth because countries have developed its human capital and its produced capital. But the per capita natural capital has a very high value because the marginal return on the natural capital that's being used for market purposes in the US or Europe is very high. Now, I can tell you that World Bank macroeconomists looked at this chart and said, this is exactly right. Natural capital is trivial in the high income countries. And so we are a human development bank. There's no need for us to worry about natural capital. It goes down in share anyway. We need to build up human capital and produce capital, which is basically wrong. And when we had these indicators of how natural capital can be viewed across total wealth, we also needed to put in stronger definitions of sustainability and to show that there's levels below which you cannot take your natural capital and still have a functioning sustainable economy. On the right-hand side, this is just data just for sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see, benchmarked over the last 25 years, the renewable natural capital and the non-renewable natural capital, the green and yellow lines, have gone way down in value per capita. But they've gone down much faster than the other two forms of capital produced and human capital have gone up. So what that means is overall per capita wealth has gone down. And so this triggers, again, concerns that these economies are not sustainable. And this was quite valuable, I think, more valuable than any SEA accounts, just to give the big picture and then open the door to investigate what is exactly going on. No questions on that. I'll jump to a third example. This was done, it should be gross ecological product, not produce, product on the top. GEP, this was created by the Chinese Academy of Sciences together with the Ministry of Environment. And it's a more manageable, it still uses valuation of lots of ecosystem services and flows, but it's a more manageable structure than the full SEA accounts. This figure shows that it overlaps with measures of GDP, but is not the same because the GEP really looks at ecosystem goods and services and how they are integrated in the economy. It doesn't look across all of GDP. But this, I'll go to the next slide. This has been used in China very concretely for policy analysis and policy initiatives. Now, maybe like, maybe any of you know China, the previous, um, well, I'm not sure what to call it. I'll call it the previous government prior to Xi Jinping, where the chairman was Hu Jintao. They declared China an ecological civilization, and they needed a definition of what ecological civilization was. So they produced this gross ecological product. But what this GEP has helped them to do is focus on policy, where they actually tracked the GEP. They have eco-compensation schemes, very similar to PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services schemes that are hundreds of millions of hectares, very successful. They have financing for enterprise that are ecosystem dependent. They have a green procurement system in the public sector that they can now track. And they even have a credit system. I'm not familiar with that in detail, but through involving banks. And one thing they do in China very well is once they have indicators and they track indicators, they hold local officials accountable. And so the GEP has been developed. It was started in a couple provinces, and now it's being scaled up basically across the country. In some cases, it's being measured at a smaller scale than a province, which makes sense because one province in China could have 100 million people. And so they scale it down, and it can be scaled upwards, downwards. But anyway, it's been proven to be quite practical, and China is not exactly evangelical with GEP, but other Asian countries have taken notice, and we should. I'm sorry, I can't give an update on how, to what extent GEP is being replicated in other countries, particularly in Asia, but I think it is happening, and I think that's a good thing. Um, so those are my three top-down models. One was the SEA. We talked about the essential framework and the ecosystem accounts. I talked about the changing wealth of nations, and then I talk about the Chinese gross ecological product. Again, some hits, some wins, and some frustrations and some challenges. Okay, bottom up. Let me just check the time. 12:35. Okay, bottom up. Um, Steve Pulaski at the University of Minnesota, if you know him, working with Richard Domaney and others at the World Bank, and with Mary Ruckelhaus and others at the Stanford NetCap project, developed what the World Bank wanted, was it called a natural capital index, and the publication ended up being called Nature's Frontiers. And what this did for many countries, and excellent data. It took them several years to develop, but I'm still calling it bottom up, not top down, because it uses the concept of production possibility frontier and Pareto optimality to look at where countries are and where they could be in trade-offs between economic valuation, production value, and nature's value.
Carter,
Now, this,
before you get too far into the bottom up approach, uh,
yes.
Peter asks, how can the USSEE convince the current regime in Washington that natural capital accounts should influence policy, compete better with China?
um, the Biden administration completed about a year, maybe before, maybe 20, I think it was last year, 2024. They completed a report on natural capital. Um, so by the very virtue, I hate to say this, Peter, but I think it's probably true. Simply by virtue of the Biden administration having done that, it's off the table because it's my sense of how vindictive the current administration is that just, anyone who talked about it in the past, it's probably, woke and they won't address it. So good question. Let's keep it in the back of my mind. How to, I mean, there's a Chinese expression, never let a, good crisis go to waste. Uh, I, that's the level of my pessimism. I just hope we have more crises that make people realize that these links are not the inventions of ecologists and economists, but they're physical risks and real risks, and there are implications.
And there's another question by Herman. What effect has GEP had on China? My impression is that economic growth through industrial development overrides everything, and that is hardly an example of ecological civilization.
I would, Herman, I would have agreed with you 10 years ago. I wouldn't agree with you now. I lived in China for 4 years. I had the privilege of working at an extremely high level on a report called China 2030, which we published in around 2011 or 12. Um, the challenge, and when I say high level, the chair of our study group was the deputy premier who then became prime minister after that. And then a few years into Xi Jinping, I mean, he lost his job. But anyway, it was at that level. The question before us was, how could China become a high income country? How could they avoid what's called the middle income trap, where a lot of countries uh, use similar technology, whether it's Malaysia, Egypt, Colombia, use similar technologies with certain similar levels of value added and become upper middle income countries. And there's far fewer countries that become upper income countries with greater levels of innovation and value added. And China wanted to be sure that it became a high income country by 2030. What would that require? And one of the 5 chapters was on the environment and green growth, where it became very clear that China could not continue on its very degraded path. And the government, at the completion of that study, declared the war against pollution is equivalent to the war against poverty. And they have put over $1 trillion into fighting pollution. And I thought at the time, I'm not surprised. China is run by engineers. Pollution is a problem they can solve. And they're well on their way to doing it because the number of what they call blue sky days was way too low. There are 100 cities in China that were some of the most polluted cities in the world, and they tackled pollution. But I was much more pessimistic 10, 12 years ago about the ecological side. But friends who continue working in China have said, no, they have really stepped up on the ecological side as well. Partly what I called um, the eco compensation schemes have been hugely successful, protected area schemes, hugely successful. Water quality has gone way up, air quality. So again, it's not perfect, but it is a different country than it was 10 years ago from an environmental point of view. And I think it's a combination of a crisis that they learned from, increasing income levels, and recognition that their cities would not be the places where they could develop the level of value added when people basically just wanted to leave. So um, that's my maybe too long answer. Oh, I see you added to the chat that you haven't been there since 2010. Yeah, I haven't been there since 2015, but I think it's really China is an example of learning and innovation.
I think,
Mm.
Herman, did you want to say something or?
No, I just wanted to put my face on so he would
Okay,
that he wasn't
thanks.
talking to the
Thanks.
wall. Right.
Thanks. Again, China's not perfect. China's not perfect by any means,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I can also say I'm glad I'm not there now because of the political environment, but still,
Mhm.
give them credit where it's due.
Right.
So bottom up, where was I? Oh yeah. So this was this trade-off analysis was very detailed trade-off analysis. If you look at the chart on croplands, grasslands, forests, what what can be used to benefit production value and what can be used, in this case, carbon sequestration, which is basically, protection or intactness. And countries always find themselves off the production possibility frontier. What here's point A, sustainable. Current scenario, no country is ever at the frontier, basically. But what this analysis allowed them to do is to look at what are the trade-offs. Do they want to go to the right to improve production values? Do they want to go up and, in this case, improve carbon storage values? Or do they want to try to move somewhere in the middle, in the upper right, diagonally to the right in that quadrant? Every country, many production possibility frontiers, again, not perfect, but a really good platform for starting dialogue at the sector level, even at the local level. I know Steve Pulaski started this work not even in the state of Oregon, but in a county or a few counties in Oregon. This can be done very locally. It could be done more at a provincial or state level. And I think this example is from Liberia. So Liberia is a small enough country. You can even look at it nationally. I'm going to move along. That's one, I think, good example. This is Becky Chaplin Kramer's work. She's at Stanford NatCap and at University of Minnesota. I just want to say that the ecologists, again, by mapping more and more ecosystem services, you can connect it to, and if you look at the little box on the bottom left, nature's contributions to people, are they connecting it to what people value, production, welfare? Are they connecting it to nature? And what are the trade-offs? And I've worked a bit with Becky on climate adaptation, and we've shown that, if you prioritize areas that have multiple benefits, let's say carbon and resilience and biodiversity, you can show that there's some critical areas for protection, and you can also show there's some critical areas for production, and you get a very good analysis of where some of the trade-offs might be. Here's a third example. This is one that I've led at WRI. The report's just coming out next Tuesday, as a matter of fact, where we looked at NBS, if you know the term, nature-based solutions, as a component of investing in climate adaptation. And we looked across lots of sectors of specific investments and the specific benefits of those investments. And we broke the benefit stream into these three categories. If you look across the bottom, avoided losses, economic benefits, and social and environmental benefits. And if you look across the total of these projects in these various sectors, it's not a large population of projects, but it's somewhat consistent that 31% in this case, 30% of the benefits are environment and social, and I can tell you 90% of those are environment. So the NBS value in climate adaptation investments is undervalued, underappreciated. This number, 31%, we came up with. If you look at by valuing carbon, by valuing nature, if you look at what they call the appraisal reports that the donor community, whether it's the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, we looked across a lot of projects. They don't value these benefits, so they don't prioritize these benefits. So this is, I hope, research that sort of helps give a little bit of boost anyway for nature is a really valuable component in investing in climate adaptation as part of a broader adaptation, part of a broader narrative that it's time to invest more in adaptation. So quickly, some observations, some challenges, and then some conclusions. I think the observations, this world is fragmented, particularly in the top down, because bottom up by definition is really not fragmented. You're looking specifically at coffee in Ghana, or you're looking specifically at, urban flooding in Dar es Salaam, something like that. So the bottom up is less fragmented, but top down very fragmented in what is actually included in the natural capital assessments and maybe valuation, maybe not, but does it include water, land, carbon, air even? Some do, some don't. And the values they measure, maybe no values, but maybe only market values, maybe non-market values. So it's very fragmented and it's not always very comparable. On the policy impact, we haven't seen a lot from the top down. And that's not just me, that's surveys, but I'm willing to have this updated. The head of the UNSEE team, and I'm blanking out on her name, moved to the IMF about a year and a half ago. And I thought that was a very interesting move. She's with the IMF Statistics Office. And so that is an indication to me that the IMF thinks it's worthwhile to invest in natural capital statistics, whether they're doing it through SEA or through the comprehensive wealth approach, I don't know. But that's, this SEA is not dead. I don't mean to imply it is, but we're still looking for policy impact. This work requires collaboration. And economics as a profession is very siloed. If you look at the top economics journals, they don't invite cross-sectoral publications. I've seen, people have counted how many in the top publications, how many articles even address sustainability. It's very few. But as economists, we know that we really have to work with natural scientists to even know what we're talking about. And so that is important. To me, it's fun and an opportunity, but in the economics profession, that is not the ticket to high visibility, frankly. And then on the last bullet, I talk about there are other ways to get data. Part of the problem with this data is that it's not always accepted by government. Government still wants, their own supply and demand type data, price data, subsidy data. So other approaches help on the biophysical side more than on the economic side. Here's some challenges. I've hinted a lot of these, so I'll go fairly quickly. Complexity, uncertainty, data, methodology, and political will. So here are my more detailed notes. Complexity we've touched on, but a lot of again, uncertainty is a big part of it. The tipping points, the irreversibility, the fact that there's undervaluation. These are all challenges to overcome. On data, primary data collection is rare, so there's a lot of model data, which isn't bad necessarily, but it's what we have. There's boundary issues, there's valuation issues, there's capacity issues, particularly in governments, and that holds us back. And then politics. Often natural capital, we did very detailed work at the World Bank on overlaying poverty and natural capital. Two factoids. Poverty is 75, 80% rural, extreme poverty. In the world, it's mostly rural. It's not urban ghettos, it's rural. Second factoid, the 80% of that rural poor lives in areas where the natural capital is degrading. So you have an immediate correlation between poverty and natural capital degradation. You don't have causality, you have correlation. But do governments even want to talk about it? No. We had what's called Admin 2 spatial data, which is at the county level for 40 some countries. And the World Bank at the board level decided this could not be published because for countries to reveal where their poorest people live was considered politically unacceptable. So the political will behind natural capital needs to be built up. Environmental concerns have to compete with short-term economic growth concerns, and we're not there yet. So this is yesterday's newspaper. I can't believe it, Peter. You know, my wife's from Fort Lauderdale, and down there, the ocean reached 98 degrees, which is killing everything. It's not only killing the ecosystem, it's going to kill tourism. It's going to generate algae bloom and degraded beaches. I mean, this is a major disaster. So here where we are, this is my last slide. How important is the calculations that we can do? You know, we know that climate change is happening fast. We're missing our, 1.5 targets. New agreements are not likely. New financing is hard to come by. Climate is affecting slow trends in the form of making tipping points more likely. And, the world is facing various crises. And on the right-hand side, the planetary boundaries show that 2/3 have been crossed. But my takeaway is let's keep at it. Let's continue work on natural capital accounting, the top down, but we do need to continue pushing at the local project and policy level that it's tangible, concrete, intuitive, and it can also help attract finance to make a difference on the ground. That's it, John.
All right. Well, thank you. There's an additional question in the chat. We can open it up for chat and comments. Laura, why don't you just go ahead and ask your questions instead of me reading them?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, really thank you so much for the great, interesting presentation. I should say that I'm an ecologist and not an economist, although I'm working on natural capital accounting. And I've been working on it for a couple of years, starting from Nordic cities and Finnish government, so where I was. I was just wondering if you can provide maybe like a little bit of a silver lining, optimistic vision before the weekend. What would it take to increase the policy impact? I mean, I know you mentioned at the end, like local level effort of natural capital accounting can be a good start, but especially in the US, I feel now is really tough. What do you think it will take? Maybe changing the language? I mean, to help making the case for nature and mainstreaming this into like policy decision making?
So I do work on climate more. I've gone, my roots were more on the environment side, but at WRI, I've been working more on climate adaptation. And part of what I do is with universities and ministries of finance across Africa, 8 countries. And what we do is to elevate the physical risk of climate. We know what those are, temperature, storms, sea level rise, which go into sectoral impacts, how those floods affect city, how those droughts affect agriculture. And then we keep elevating it up to what we call the macro critical risks of climate change. And we're very specific. We talk to ministries of finance and we say, we don't expect you to understand the physical risk of climate, but we want you to understand the pathways and the macro critical risks. Those are risk to growth and jobs, risk to debt sustainability, risk to trade, risk to the financial sector stability, risk to fiscal balances, revenue and expenditure. So by speaking their language, we're able to basically open the door that the climate is a concern that they have to think about. And then we can start thinking about, okay, what now that they're worried, where do they start? If you're a small African country, your emissions are not going to change your climate impacts. You need to adapt in a certain way, and so we can look across various sectors and what are the pathways that relate to growth, jobs, trade, debt. I think the same is true for nature. We need to talk their language, which is why I hope you got the idea that I did very much like the World Bank Changing Wealth of Nations assessment of how natural capital supports overall wealth accounting, overall sustainability, and the overall ability of an economy to produce income. And I've seen it work. I mentioned Colombia, I mentioned Laos, and hopefully my World Bank colleagues, when I left 6 years ago, have had other examples. But I think we need to convert what we do into language that the ministries of finance, and I would say ministries of finance are quite key, not only because they manage subsidies, policy, tax policy, but they also manage budgets and where the investments go.
We
So
have
that's,
oops, sorry.
yeah, no, that's my take.
We have a question by Tanya.
Sorry, I know we only have 1 more minute, so I'll try to be quick. I'm working with the creation of a new type of company, natural asset companies with intrinsic exchange group, where the valuation of the company is based on the natural capital value and ecosystem service values. We're actually collaborating with WRI and
Oh,
getting
good.
ready to bring this to market. Part of our obstacle has been the need for a global standard on natural capital valuation and ecosystem service valuation. And really, the SEA framework has been the best standard we have identified. I know last year ISO also put out a standard for natural capital valuation, but we need something that regulators can regulate and kind of hold companies accountable to. I wonder if you can give any reflections, insights, inputs on where the private sector can go to have a standard that has interoperability, at the government level, we need to speak the same language. There's so much arbitrariness in how this can be done. That's kind of our need, and I know CIE is imperfect, but what would be your advice for the search for a standard for natural capital accounting?
Yeah, well, the standard is for valuation, the standard you need. The standard isn't for GDP. And SEA is a standard for national accounts. And you don't need a national account standard to look at the land holding of a natural asset company in country XYZ. But I agree with you. There's no current standard for valuation. And I know a lot of people say, well, let's not let the best be the enemy of good. Let's just go with per hectare units, or maybe per hectare stratified by ecosystem quality, that sort of thing. And I would support that. I want to be practical, and I don't want to fight. If we wait for SEA to give you a standard, it won't happen. I mean, SEA is a standard. I mean, it's approved, but it's approved for national accounts, and that doesn't help you. So you need a different one. And I don't think the UN, well, I can't say the UN won't give it to you, but the process they followed might be a process that you would have to follow again to come up with a consensus.
Are there any other questions or comments? There's one in the chat from Peter. The Capital Coalition is a spinoff of TEEB, has developed a framework for companies to value the whole panoply of capitals, including nature. So.
Right. I mean, I think of the world. I think the world of the Capital Coalition and what they've done. But what I was just saying to Laura is that it has to be accepted. And so let's try. If they have a good approach, let's try to socialize it. Let's try to get others to buy into it. I mean, this has been true of many processes, like the science-based targets, getting people to buy into it, like NGFS on nature to get into buy into disclosure standards. I mean, this happens all the time with a new economic or financial concept. I mean, people have to buy into it and they have to understand it and know about it. If you can get the MDBs on board, that would be great, but I think Capital Coalition has probably thought a lot about that. So Peter, you can probably learn from them.
All right, so we are out of time, but before we go, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do this seminar today. It was excellent. I know a lot of people have already commented that they learned a lot and found it very informative, and we can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to do this for us, and it's really important work, and we thank you very much for that.
Okay, you're welcome. Great.
Thank you,
Take
everybody.
care.
Have a nice weekend.
Thanks. Good to see you, Carter. Be in
Yeah.
touch.
Take care. Good. Bye.
Bye.